Chapter 1. The Cold Bed. Marcus Eisen had never been on the sea before, despite having lived next to it his whole life. He stood at the rail of the Merchant's Promise sailing out from Port Eisenton and watched the storm coast shrink behind them, cliffs like broken teeth, gray stone estates clinging to headlands, his father's house among them, though too distant now to distinguish. The sea moved under the ship in ways that made his stomach uncertain. Salt air stung his eyes. His servant, Pip, 14 and seasick since they'd cleared the harbor, leaned against a coil of rope nearby and looked miserable. "You'll find your sea legs," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. His own legs felt borrowed. Pip nodded without conviction and closed his eyes. The argument with his father lived in Marcus's chest still. 3 days gone, but fresh as morning. He'd made his case over breakfast. A year's apprenticeship at the Grand Library in West, newly reopened after the sorceress Cassaria's fall. A chance to study with scholars who'd spent a lifetime researching almost anything in 4 kingdoms. His father had set down his knife. "Poetry," Lord Eisen had said. "Not a question, an indictment. History, translation, geographic records. Poetry." His father's voice could have frozen the porridge. "My son wants to spend a year fondling dusty books in a foreign city." Marcus had prepared arguments, the value of education, the connections he might make, the way knowledge of the West might serve the Storm Coast's trading interests. He'd opened his mouth to deploy them. His brother Rain had laughed, a short bark of sound. "Let him go. We'll have a year without him mooning over verses at dinner." Lord Eisen had looked at Rain, then back at Marcus. Something shifted in his face. Not softening. Calculation. "1 year," he'd said. "You'll take Pip. You'll comport yourself as it befits our house. And when you return, you'll accept the marriage I will arrange." Marcus had agreed before his father could reconsider, even though the last demand filled him with dread. Now the storm coast was gone and the sea was everywhere, gray-green and restless under spring sky. The Merchant's Promise carried grain and timber, 12 passengers, a crew of 20. The captain was a weathered woman named Daria, who'd made this run 4 times every year for the past decade, and knew it well. Marcus had watched her at the wheel and felt obscurely comforted by her competence. The first week passed in a rhythm of nausea and adjustment. Pip stopped vomiting. Marcus discovered he liked the way the ship moved if he didn't fight it. He read in their tiny shared cabin, a book of poetry written before the werewolf wars he'd packed against his father's hypothetical inspection of his things. The verses were old enough to be respectable and beautiful enough to matter. At night, he could hear the sea against the hull and felt, for the first time in his life, like he might be going towards something instead of failing to be what was expected. The mist came on the 8th night. Marcus woke to wrongness, a quality of silence that didn't belong. Broken voices overhead, the ship moving differently. He reached for Pip in the dark. "Stay here." "What's happening?" "I don't know." "Stay." He pulled on his coat and went up to the deck. Mist everywhere, thick as wet wool, turning lamplight to smudges. Figures moving. Too many figures, and some of them wrong. The crew backing toward the rail. A voice, not Captain Daria's, giving orders. "Anyone fights, we start cutting throats. Anyone cooperates, you'll be drinking terrible ale and telling this story tomorrow night." Marcus's eyes adjusted. Men and women in dark clothes, armed, swords and crossbows, and knives catching what little light there was. The crew of the Merchant's Promise herded together, Captain Daria standing very still, her face expressionless. A man built like a bull gestured at the passengers' cabins. "Get them up. Anyone valuable, separate them out." Marcus understood then, the way you understand you're falling after your foot's already left the ground. Pirates. They pulled everyone on deck. The merchant's wife clutching her daughter, the two scholars traveling together, old Lord Fenn, who'd been visiting his sister, Marcus, and Pip. They ransacked the cabins with efficient speed, took his meager funds for the trip, took the strongbox from Captain Daria, took the merchant's wife's jewelry, took anything that might be worth coin. The man, like a bull, walked down the line of passengers and stopped at Lord Fenn, then the merchant's wife and her daughter, then Marcus. "You lot. Over there." The merchant's wife pulled her daughter closer. The girl couldn't have been more than 10, wide-eyed and silent with fear. "Both of you," the man said. Not unkind, but absolute. Marcus started toward the separated group. Pip moved to follow. The man put out a hand. "Not you. Just the Lord's son." "He's my servant," Marcus started. "He's a messenger." The man's voice was flat. "Lord's son travels with a servant. The servant goes back and tells Papa what happened. That's how this works." They bound Marcus's wrists, rough rope tied by someone who knew knots. Lord Fenn's, the merchant's wife's. Though they left the daughter's hands free, the girl clung to her mother's skirts with desperation, loaded them into a boat that appeared out of the mist like a nightmare's prop. Marcus looked back at the merchant's promise. Pip stood at the rail, white-faced. "Tell my father," Marcus said, then stopped. "What? That he was taken?" Pip would do that. That he was afraid? That wouldn't help. That he hoped to be ransomed? Too late. They were rowing away, into whiteness. The ship that loomed out of the fog was bigger than Marcus had expected. 3 masts, dark hull, darker sails furled, men and women hauling on lines, bringing cargo up from the merchant vessel. Organized chaos, every person knowing their role, moving with purpose. They hauled Marcus and the others aboard, tied them to the mainmast. Marcus sat with his back against the wood and tried to think. Pip would reach Port Isenton. How long? A week if the winds were fair, longer if not. Then someone would have to ride to the estate. His father would receive word, would decide. Would his father pay? The calculation was simple and cold. Ransom, or permanent relief from an embarrassing son who preferred books to weapons, poetry to hunting, gentle things to the hard masculinity of the storm coast. Rain would argue against paying, leaving him to man up. His father might listen. Marcus watched the crew work. Watched the boat return to the merchant's promise a second time, a third. Watched the merchant vessel finally drift away into the mist, crippled but afloat, her sails damaged but her hull intact. Captain Daria would make port. Pip would carry the message home. And then Marcus would discover what he was worth, if anything at all. The sun climbed higher. The crew worked with practiced efficiency, sorting plunder, checking rigging, moving about their tasks with the ease of people who knew their ship and each other. No one spoke to the hostages. No one even looked at them for long. Then the captain emerged from below deck. Marcus knew immediately who it was, though he'd never laid eyes on the man before. Something in the way the crew straightened, the way space opened around him, the way he moved across the deck like he owned not just the ship, but the very sea beneath it. Stocky and shorter than Marcus had expected, but solid, the kind of build that spoke of strength rather than height. Dark hair cropped close to the skull, face weathered by sun and salt, marked with old scars. He wore dark leather and darker wool, loose clothes that hung on a frame gone soft around the middle, and moved with the dangerous grace of someone who'd survived more fights than most people could imagine. Trey Blacksail. The man was about a decade older than Marcus and charming in a way that screamed danger, but made Marcus unable to look away anyway. Blacksail stopped in front of the hostages and looked them over the way you'd assess livestock. "Captain Daria will make it to shore within the week," Blacksail said. Voice softer than he had expected. Accent Marcus couldn't place. "She'll send word. Your people will have terms the week after. Follow the rules. You'll be home before summer. Fight, run, or irritate me. A shrug. The sea's deep and nobody keeps ledgers of what goes into it. Blacksail moved closer then, studying each of them in turn. Lord Fen received a cursory glance. Old, frail, not interesting beyond the ransom he'd bring. The merchant's wife and daughter got longer consideration. The captain crouched in front of the girl. "What's your name?" The child pressed against her mother and didn't answer. "She's Sully. She will be 10 this coming summer," the merchant's wife said. Her voice shook only slightly. "I'm Celine. My husband is Torian of the Green Pearl Trading Company. He'll pay whatever you ask." "I'm sure he will." Blacksail straightened, moved to Marcus. Marcus made himself meet the captain's eyes. Brown, he noticed. Dark brown, almost black in the dim light. The kind of eyes that had seen things Marcus couldn't imagine. Sharp. They had a hungry gleam in them now. Nobody had looked at Marcus like that before. Blacksail tilted his head, studying. Reached out and caught Marcus's chin. Calloused fingers, grip firm but not cruel. Turned his face to catch the light from the deck lanterns and first rays of the sun breaking through the mist. "Pretty," the captain said. Not a question. An assessment. Heat flooded Marcus's face. He tried to pull back, but Blacksail held him still a moment longer, then released him and stepped back. "This one," Blacksail said to the man built like a bull. "Bring him to my quarters this evening. My bed could use warming, and a cute little thing like him will do the trick nicely." The words landed like stones. The merchant's wife, Celine, made a small sound. When Marcus dared look at her, her face was complicated. Worry in her eyes, yes, but something else. Relief? Guilt? She pulled Sully closer, grateful the captain's attention had moved past them, but fully aware what the attention might mean for Marcus. "Aye, Captain," the bullman said. Blacksail walked away then, calling orders. The crew scattered. The ship moved beneath them. Sails catching wind, deck tilting, everything purposeful. Marcus sat very still. He'd read enough to know what bed warming meant. Some of it in respectable novels where such things were implied with discretion. Some of it in less respectable material that had circulated through his school. Cheap pamphlets passed hand to hand, stories that made the older boys laugh and the younger ones blush. He knew what men who liked men did together, and what some pirates did to prisoners without bothering to ask for permission. But Blacksail had a reputation. The stories always mentioned it. The pirate who killed rapists without hesitation, who left them bleeding in gutters if he caught them bragging of their deeds in taverns. Would a man like that force an unwilling prisoner? Marcus's face still burned where the captain had touched him. That was the part he didn't understand. At school, there had been boys who'd made advances. Marcus had always declined. Gently, because he wasn't cruel, but firmly. He'd thought he knew himself. He noticed beauty in men the way you noticed beauty in architecture or poetry, with aesthetic appreciation, but no desire. This wasn't that. The way his stomach had dropped when the captain studied him, the heat in his face, the awareness of those calloused fingers against his skin. He'd blushed like a girl at her first dance. That scared him almost as much as the captain's words. Lord Fen was praying again, low murmured verses asking for deliverance. Celine held Sully and stared at nothing. The crew worked around them, securing cargo, adjusting lines, settling into the rhythm of a ship under sail. Marcus leaned his head back against the mast and tried to think. Evening. They'd said evening. He had hours, then. Hours to prepare himself for whatever was coming. Hours to figure out why his heart was beating so hard and whether it was only fear. The sun rose slowly, burning away the mist. The singing siren, he'd heard the crew call her that, cut through gray-green water under black sails. The storm coast was gone. The merchant's promise was gone. Pip was gone. Marcus was a hostage on a pirate ship, and he couldn't stop thinking about the captain's eyes and the cold bed in need of warming. He was thinking of the evening and found to his surprise that terror was mixing with something else. Something like anticipation. He'd never felt anything like it before. It felt like being alive. Beautifully, gloriously, briefly perhaps, but undeniably alive. Chapter 2. The Chains. By noon, Trey Blacksail had decided she was a fool. Not for taking the merchantman. There was no shame in profit taken cleanly, no shame in a run executed without blood. The singing siren ate slow ships for breakfast. That was what she was built to do. That was simple. For the boy. The lordling, barely of age, with hair like late wheat and eyes too honest for the sea. Pretty in a way that made men stupid and women dangerous, and made Trey, who had worked hard, for years, to be neither, feel a tug in her chest like a rope going taut. She'd touched his chin. She'd let herself do that, in front of everyone, as if she were some tavern brute selecting a girl for the night. She was 27 now, and she had been too old to be this foolish about a boy at 13 when she took this ship. The day stretched long and bright with spring sun, and Trey found herself thinking about the boy at the most inconvenient moments, while she checked the lashings of the plunder, while she listened to Bang drill the crew, while she leaned over a chart at the small table bolted to the deck and corrected Hawk's course by a half point, because currents here did not always behave as expected, and math told her things Hawk could not see. It was absurd. It was indulgent. It was human. And that made it even worse. She told herself that picking the boy came down to two things. The first was practical, and Trey prided herself on practicality. She needed a pair of hands in her cabin. Not crew hands. Not the hands that hauled lines and hauled bodies and hauled crates of stolen goods. The crew could do many things, and did them well, but there were some services a captain could not accept without paying a price he did not intend to pay. The three men who knew her secret, had been on board when she took the ship, were utterly unacceptable for different reasons, on top of the fact that they would simply refuse to do the work she needed. Green, Marcel of the Green Isle, was loyalty made flesh. He had fed her when she was starving, had stood between her and a captain who thought a child was a thing you could use up. He had become, without being asked, something like a father. Hawk, her helmsman, had eyes like sea glass and hands like driftwood, steady, weathered, strange. He read wind the way other men read ink, and he could not read ink at all. There was something in him that listened to the ship as if it were a living animal. Trey trusted him with her life. She did not want him anywhere near her chest binder, her bruises, the small humiliations she accepted so she could walk the world as a man. And Bang had taught her to fight. Bang had tried to break her and discovered the annoying truth. She did not break. He respected her. He did not love her. He was an asshole with a ledger in his head that recorded every weakness he ever saw, filed away for the day he might need it, and that meant he was to be kept at arm's length. So Trey needed someone else. Someone soft. Someone who didn't smell like tar and old sweat and rope. Someone she could order to fetch water and scrub salt off her back and lace her into clothing with the calm obedience of a servant. Someone who would not speak of what was under her baggy clothes. The lordling looked impressionable enough to be frightened into silence once he was home again. A pretty boy with a poet's mouth didn't want to be known as the kind of man who had warmed a pirate captain's bed. Shame was a leash as good as any chain, and quieter. She could have taken a woman, but a woman's reputation was a much more fragile thing than a man's. He could go home even if his place on her ship became known and live just fine. A woman would not. That was the second reason, Trey told herself. The lordling would live just fine when he returned home. No harm done. Practical, sensible, honorable by her own understanding of honor. She repeated those words in her head until they began to sound like the truth. It did not change the fact that when she closed her eyes, she saw his blush. It did not change the warmth that had climbed her throat when she said pretty aloud and felt the deck's attention sharpen like knives. It did not change the simplest truth of all. She wanted him. Not like she wanted coin or wind or a ship that answered her hand. Like she wanted a song. She had no intention of forcing him. There were lines Trey did not cross. Not because the world demanded it, but because she had once been a child chained to a bed and had learned exactly what force did to a person's soul. It hollowed you out. It made you into a room with the furniture ripped away, and what she had put back in the years after left no space for becoming something that had made her. If she took anything from the boy, she wanted it given. She wanted him to choose her, with eyes open. Honor, in Trey's hands, had always been a private thing. A promise made to herself in the dark. It was also, she admitted, a word that could be bent until it meant what you needed it to mean. There were other ways than force to corrupt a young man. Flattery, attention, safety. A choice presented as if it were a gift, when really it was a hook. She made peace with the fact that she was only human after all, and went to the locker under her bed. It was iron-banded oak, warped slightly from salt and time. The key stuck, as it always did. Trey put her shoulder into it and felt the familiar reluctant give. Inside were items she did not use often. A spare binder, a length of fine chain for locking a chest to a deck ring, a small bag of coins that she had found curious and therefore kept, and the companion chains. She pulled them out and let them rest on her knees. They were a curious bit of equipment, and not because of their craft. Any blacksmith with patience could have made them. The curiosity lay in how thoughtfully they had been designed for comfort. 2 wrist shackles, padded on the inside with softened leather, adjustable, buckled in 3 places so they could fit a child or a man with thick forearms. The metal edges were rounded. There were no spikes, no barbs, nothing that tore skin unless you pulled against it until you bled. Between them ran a short chain with multiple lock points, options, as if the owner expected moods to change. Another longer length of chain hung from one cuff. The cuffs themselves opened with 1 key, usually kept hidden. The chain between them and the longer chain disconnected from the cuffs, with another, smaller key. There were matching rings bolted in discreet places all over the ship where a captain might be. Beside the chart table, beneath the bench in the stern cabin, behind the curtain near the wardrobe, under the captain's chair, and one, cold and black, on the wall beside the bed. You could forget what they were until the chain reminded you of the limits. Trey had worn them for 6 years. She knew intimately how far one would reach at each of those points. She could still feel the weight of them on her wrists sometimes, phantom pressure that came with certain smells, rum spilled on wood, sweat and candle smoke, the stale breath of men who thought a child was a thing you could borrow. She tested the locks out of habit, oiled the hinges with a drop from a small vial, and rubbed the leather padding between her fingers until it softened. Her hands did not shake. That was another curious thing. The body remembered fear, but it also learned to file it away. She took the smaller key, the one for the chain disconnects, and threaded it onto a cord. The cord went around her neck and disappeared beneath her shirt, resting against skin that was already tender from binding. Resignation tasted like iron. Let this not end with a cut throat, she thought, and the thought was so dry it might have been humor. The last man to wear the key around his neck had been Captain John One-Eye, and Trey had cut his throat herself now 14 years ago and taken the key. If the boy slit hers in turn, it would be poetic. The world liked that kind of symmetry. It was also why she would not give him the chance without watching him carefully. Honor did not require stupidity. Evening came in stages. First, the sky turning the color of old pewter, then the wind lowering its voice. Then the ship's lanterns lit one by one until the deck became a scattering of small, contained suns. The hostages were moved below in an order that suited Trey. Not because she took pleasure in it, she did not bother lying to herself about that either, but because a ship ran on order, and hostages were like any other cargo. You stowed them wrong and you paid in damage later. Celine and her daughter Sully went together to the small cabin off the mid-deck passage where sound carried poorly. A lock on the outside, a bucket, a blanket. Better than the streets of Port Isenton, where a merchant woman and a girl with soft hands might be prey to men who did not require ransom to justify their cruelty. Lord Fenn went to the other side, into the narrow space that had once held spare sailcloth. He'd been on Trey's ship before. He knew what to expect: boredom, discomfort, hunger that never quite became starvation. He also knew Trey did not break ransoms that paid. Trey had considered briefly a repeat customer discount. Then she remembered that Lord Fenn had 4 sons, all successful merchants, all eager to display filial devotion with coin when it suited them. They could afford to buy him back twice in 5 years, in hopes of a bigger slice of the inheritance. She waited until the hostages were settled, until the crew had eaten, until the ship's noises had softened into night. Rope creak, wood sigh, the steady hush of water along the hull. Then she called for Green. He came as he always did, without hurry and without question. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the calm presence of a man who could end a fight by stepping into it. In the lamplight, his hair was threaded with gray. "You rang, Captain," he said. Trey kept her face blank, kept her voice low. A captain was a man. A captain did not blush at his own decisions. "Fetch the lordling," she said. Green's eyes flicked to the bed where the companion chains were neatly laid out. Something like distaste crossed his face, not for Trey, not quite, but for the memory the object carried. "I," he said anyway, because loyalty was what he had chosen, and Trey did not let him unchoose it. When Green returned, the boy came with him. Marcus Eisen walked with his hands bound in front of him, shoulders held too stiffly. He had been washed, at least as much as a hostage could be washed with a bucket and a cup. His hair was still damp at the ends, curling slightly, like he'd been trying to make himself presentable for a judgment. His eyes went to Trey and held, as if he could will courage into himself by force. Trey respected that. Green closed the door behind them and stood with his back to it, arms folded. Trey stepped forward and let herself look at the boy openly. Pretty? Yes. But it wasn't only that. It was the softness of his mouth, the delicacy of his bones, the way he watched her as if she were a story, and he couldn't decide whether he was eager or terrified to turn the page. "You're Marcus Eisen, second son of Lord Eisen," Trey said. She did not add a title because titles were tools, and she did not offer him one for free. His throat bobbed. "Yes." His voice surprised her. Clear, educated, not weak. "Not yet. And you understand why you're here?" A pause, a breath. "To be ransomed." Trey made a small sound that might have been laughter if she were in a kinder mood. "That's why you're on my ship." She held up the padded shackles so he could see them properly. His eyes widened. The color drained from his face and then returned in a faint flush. He knew what they were. Of course he did. Noble boys always knew more than their fathers pretended. He'd had books. He'd had schoolmates. He'd had curiosity. Trey watched the conflict on his face with clinical attention and something less clinical underneath it. "I won't hurt you," she said, and meant it in the way she meant most things, precisely, and with room for interpretation. "You will do what I ask. You will not be harmed. Do you understand?" Marcus licked his lips once. His gaze slid, briefly, to Green, as if asking whether this was a performance or a truth. Green's face gave nothing away. "I understand," Marcus said. Trey stepped close enough that he could smell her. Salt, leather, the faint bitterness of the tea she'd been drinking all day to keep her hands busy. She took his bound wrists and turned them so the rope knot faced up. Her fingers were competent, quick. She could have untied him entirely. She did not yet. She slid the padded cuffs onto him instead, buckling them snug. Not tight enough to bruise, tight enough that he would feel them every time he moved. He did not flinch. He did not pull away. His breath was fast, but he held still and let her work as if he had decided that obedience was safer than pride. Trey attached the chain between the cuffs with the smaller key and let the longer chain hang for a moment so he could feel its weight. "Comfortable," she said, almost conversationally. "If you don't fight them." Marcus swallowed. "Are you—" "Am I what?" Trey asked and tilted her head the way she had on deck. She watched him react to it again, watched the flush deepen like a bruise blooming. He couldn't say the word. Good. Let him learn to speak carefully. Trey moved him to the bed and fastened the chain to the wall ring beside it, leaving him enough slack to sit, to stand, to reach the basin on the table, but not enough to reach the door. Green made a low sound in his throat. Trey didn't look at him. "Don't," she said softly. "Captain," Green began, and there was something like a warning in it. Not defiance. Concern. Trey finally turned her head. Let him see her eyes. Let him see the steel. "He's not a child," she said, "and I am not One Eye." Green's mouth tightened. His gaze went to Marcus, then back to Trey. "No," he said, and the single syllable held a world of agreement and a smaller, sharper world of doubt. Trey heard it anyway. She faced Marcus again and made her voice lighter, almost amiable. "You'll be my personal maid tonight." Marcus blinked at the word, uncertain whether it was an insult or threat. Trey smiled without softness. "Water, soap, hands at my back where I can't reach, clothing laced correctly. You will keep quiet. You will obey. In return, you will eat better than Lord Fenn, and you will not be touched by anyone else on this ship." Marcus's eyes flickered. That landed. Safety offered as a bargain. A leash offered as a gift. "And the bed?" he asked, voice too careful. Trey stepped closer, close enough that he had to bend his head to look at her, close enough that the chain lifted and whispered its warning. "The bed needs warming," she said with a smirk. "That's all there is to it for now. Until you ask for more. And what more is going to mean is entirely up to me at that point." Her voice was almost teasing now, whispering the last words close to his rapidly reddening ear. She watched him consider, watched the tension in his shoulders shift, imperceptibly, from panic to something else. Thoughtful, curious, the terrible, beautiful danger of a young man realizing he might want what he is afraid of. Green watched too. He had known Trey when she was small enough to hide under a table, when she flinched at footsteps, when those very chains had been something done to her rather than something she owned. He would never have believed he'd see her fit them on another person's wrists. His eyes held mild disdain now, not for Marcus, not even for Trey, but for the world that made this kind of object useful at all. And beneath it, Trey read something quieter. Grief, perhaps, and a fear that Trey understood too well. Fear that she was becoming what had shaped her. Green saw and understood why she did not see the danger. It was not brutality. If she did this the way she was capable of doing it, not with force, but with charm and patience and a promise of safety, she could ruin the boy more thoroughly than any brute ever could. Corrupt him into wanting the wrong things. Then send him home when the ransom was paid, and make him try to fit his delicate, tarnished self back into his father's hard, clean house. He would fail, Green knew, and most likely not survive the failure. Green kept his thoughts to himself because Trey had always done what she wanted, but he could not deny himself some compassion for the boy. Trey reached up and adjusted the cord around her neck, ensuring the small key lay hidden beneath cloth. Then she turned away to pour water into the wash basin, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Come here, Marcus," she said. "Let's see if you can be useful." Green left quietly,